The other film that Walt put in as a sneak peek in Pinocchio was Peter Pan, the story of a boy who never grew up and brought 3 British kids to his home, Neverland. Like Alice in Wonderland, Walt planned this as early as 1935. He finally received the rights 4 years later after he came to an arrangement with the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. The movie was originally planned to be a follow-up to Bambi, but we all know what the war did to the studio, so Walt had to put the project on hold until 1949. Like Pinocchio, the plan was more different before the war kicked in. Nana, the darling's dog, was supposed to be with them to Neverland, and it had a much darker ending, I can tell you that. British actress Catherine Beaumont, who did Alice in the last film I talked about, returned to do the voice and the live-action model of Wendy in this film. There are rumors that the live-action reference model of Tinkerbell was Marilyn Monroe, but it was actually Margaret Carey, who also did the voice of a red-haired mermaid, no, not that one, in the film! Speaking of Tink, later on, she would become one of Disney's biggest icons and appear in Walt's TV shows, theme parks, her own spin-offs, and even earn a Hollywood Walk of Fame. Peter Pan was noted to be the last film that all 9 of Walt's 9 old men worked together as directing animators. When it was released in 1953, it did better and it was more likable than Alice in Wonderland. It became Michael Jackson's favorite film of all times, which explains why he called one of his homes Neverland Ranch, and it inspired the Battlestar Galactica series. In what way, I really don't know. Anyways, in 1955, they released Lady and the Tramp, Disney's first story to be completely original. You know, that's what I find weird about Disney. After about 20 years in the movie business, finally he decided to do something that's not based on a story? In this film, it's the story of 2 dogs that have a different lifestyle and a different attitude on life that fall in love. The idea all began when storyman Joe Grant drew some sketches of his Springer Spaniel, and Walt told him to make a storyboard out of it. Then Walt saw it and said,
"You know what? Screw it."
Okay, that may not be his exact words, but then Walt read a short on the Cosmopolitan called Happy Dan the Whistling Dog. A few years later, he hired the author, Ward Green, and the animators used Grant's storyboard like examples. The script, however, had to be constantly revised. The rejected names for Tramp were Bozo, Rags, and even Homer. There was even a deleted scene where Lady was having nightmares about the baby like in Pink Elephants on Parade. An obstacle that the animators were waiving difficulties was the CinemaScope. Today, it's called widescreen. It was brand new at the time, so it took longer and it was way more annoying for them. On the light side of development, the idea of Lady being given as a present in a hatbox in the opening came from an event in real life. Walt gave his wife a dog the same way. The settings was based on Walt's hometown in Marceline, Missouri, when he was a boy. The hyena laugh in the zoo scene would later on be used for the voice of the character in the Crash Bandicoot video game series, Ripperoo. And let's not forget about the infamous spaghetti moment. When it was released, it was a huge success thanks to Peggy Lee, one of the actresses in the film, when she promoted it on the Disneyland TV show. Even though the critics complained about a few stuff, today it's considered a classic. In 1959, Sleeping Beauty hit the screen. The story of a princess named Aurora who got cursed by the evil Maleficent and falls asleep until true love's first kiss. So it's up to Prince Philip and 3 fairies that raised the princess to save her. For the production, the film almost took an entire decade to make it. Writing started in 1951, voices in 1952, animation began in 1953 and finished in 1958, and the score was recorded in 1957. Speaking of the score, It was based on Tchaikovsky's ballet of the same name, making it the first Disney film with no original soundtrack. To make the animation stand out than the other films, Walt hired animator Ivan Earl to be chief background designer and color stylist. Earl also had some freedom for the design and colors. Originally, there were supposed to be 7 fairies, like in the original Charles Perrault version, but they cut it down to 3 and let the legends Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson to do the rest. Walt also let another legend, Mark Davis, to do the design of Maleficent. But one animator who worked on this film that has to be mentioned is, surprisingly, Chuck Jones. That's right, the same animation director Chuck Jones from the Looney Tunes fame. He worked there for a short time when Warner Brothers replaced his animation department for 3D films. When the 3D idea was a failure and brought animation back, Jones went back to the WB. Not only that this was the longest to make, this was the most expensive film that Walt had ever made. And by expensive, I mean more than a $6 million budget. When it was released, it didn't do well at the box office, but hey, that's what re-releases are for at the time. During production, Walt was also building Disneyland. To promote the film, the Imagineers called the park's icon Sleeping Beauty's castle instead of Snow White's. The villain, Maleficent, would later become Disney's greatest villain of all times, and is the main antagonist in other places like the nighttime show Fantasmic, the book series The Kingdom Keepers, and the Square Enix video game Kingdom Hearts. Moving along, 2 years later, Disney released 101 Dalmatians. It's the story of 2 Dalmatians who had 15 puppies, but got stolen by fashion designer Cruella de Vil to turn them into a fur coat, along with many other puppies. Now Pongo and Perdita have to save the 99 puppies from Cruella and her 2 henchmen. By the way, take a good look at the title. Dalmatians is said to be the most misspelled Disney word because a lot of people spell it like Dalmatians with an O replacing the third A. This was the first film to only use the Xerox process. It's something to turn drawings into cells. This new thing was great for the animators, since they have to draw all the Dalmatians and their spots. And it was one of the reasons, according to Chuck Jones, that the budget was way lower than it would have been. There were less animators working due to the failure of Sleeping Beauty, and Walt wasn't into it than his other films because he focused more on his TV shows and his theme park. There's a guy, who I think has no life, counted all the spots in the film, frame by frame, and counted 6,469,952 spots in total! During the famous Twilight Bark scene, one of the dogs was Jock the Scottish Terrier from Lady and the Tramp. Later in that scene, they even put in Lady helping out to find the puppies. When it was released, it was a huge success since it was the 10th highest grossing film of 1961 and it won a BAFTA award. In 1996, they released a live-action version of the film and they even made a sequel. In 1963, they brought out The Sword and the Stone. It's a King Arthur story where a boy nicknamed Wart is learning to be Merlin's apprentice. He gets turned into a lot of animals, a witch named Mim tried to destroy him, and Wart would later become King Arthur. In my research, I was surprised to find very little facts about this film. One of the reasons could be that people say it was dated because of the many 60s reference. But anyways, here's what I found so far. The battle scene with Merlin and Mim was said by animation experts to be some of the best character animation to date. The reason is that they transform while they retain their identity features. This was the first film to feature songs written by the legendary brothers Robert and Richard Sherman. This was also the first Disney film to only have one director, which is one of the 9 old men, Wolfgang Reitherman. When it was released, it was, once again, a huge box office success, but not for the critics. A lot of people say that it was Walt's stab to them. They say Walt was represented as Merlin, heck, the designer gave Merlin's Walt's nose, so that could be a hint, and Mim was represented as the critics. But hey, Good or bad, it's still considered a Disney classic, and it was nominated for an Oscar for Best Score.